So good afternoon, participants. Thank you very much for joining our conference from different parts of the world. Now we would like to start KDI-3ie-ADB-ADBI Conference on International Impact Evaluation. To open the conference, I'd like to invite Asian Development Bank Chief Economist, Mr. Yasuyuki Sawada. Sawada-san, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Takashi. Good afternoon, or good morning, good evening, wherever you are, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to join KDI School 3ie-ADB-ADBI Conference on Impact Evaluation, Challenges and Promise for Human Capital Development in Asia. Not to mention, impact evaluation, especially prospective impact evaluation using a rigorous methods such as randomized control trial, RCT, or other quasi-experiment method has been the very core element of evidence-based policy making. But due to COVID-19 pandemic, a number of new challenges already emerged in the arena of impact evaluation. We also see evolution of impact evaluation methodologies and usage in policies, particularly use of satellite imagery, real-time mobility information from mobile phone, high frequency, administrative data, and other big data, etc., seem to reinforce the already emerged trend of agile impact evaluation or nimble impact evaluation. This annual impact evaluation event has been organized by KDIS and 3ie for several years. And since the last year, ADB, my home institute, joined the team. And now ADB Institute also joined the force this year. I'm happy to tell you that we have two special sessions today to address evolution of impact evaluation under COVID-19, one on big data and the other on COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to human capital sessions, education health sessions. We also have a very nice capacity building training session today. So today we have a highly selected 15 presentation out of many submission. Actually, we receive a lot of submission, much more than our prior expectation. And also some numbers on webinar today, as of this morning, today, 2 a.m. today, 368 people registered for this webinar. And all over the world, mainly Asia, but as well as from Europe, we have 3 presentations from Europe as well. I'd like to thank collaboration institutions again, KDIS, Korea Development Institute School of Public Policy, and 3ie, International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, 3ie, Asian Development Bank, and the Asian Development Bank Institute, ADBI, and also Hong Kong University of Science Technology participating this year, and also officially joining this annual event from next year. This exciting research collaboration forum platform, I really hope we can expand this Asian network of development economics from now on. Anyway, I'm looking forward to joining the exciting presentation and lively discussion today. So with that, I'd like to end my initial keynote. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief Economist, Mr. Sawada. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Jun-Il Yu, KDS School of Public Policy Management Dean. Mr. Yu, please come in.
Well, Dr. Sawada, Dean Sonobe, Dr. Jimenez, distinguished colleagues and honored guests, good afternoon, morning, good evening. On behalf of KDI School of Public Policy and Management, I'm delighted to welcome you to the KDI School 3ie-ADB-ADBI Conference on Impact Evaluation 2020. Let me also thank our organizers and today's host, the Asian Development Bank, for putting together this wonderful event. 2 years ago, KDI School held its first conference with 3ie to raise awareness for the use of impact evaluation among development practitioners and promote evidence-based this meeting. Since the successful inaugural event, the ADB has joined in and shared its knowledge and experience in this. Now, as we execute our third conference on impact evaluation, we are excited to welcome ADBI as a new partner. The longer the list of partners grows, the more we can do to foster knowledge sharing and mutual learning initiatives, go beyond familiar agenda and move the field forward, both in research and education. Ladies and gentlemen, as we are nearing the end of the year 2020, I cannot but recall the many challenges and upheavals COVID-19 has brought to my life, both personal and professional. Most of my time and energy, I feel, have been spent on ensuring the quality of education while protecting health and safety of our students, faculty, and staff this year. I can hardly complain, however, given the devastating toll of the pandemic on societies and economies around the world, especially in developing countries that lack the resources with which to provide a cushion to the sharp edges of. We were already off track by the end of 2019 with the Sustainable Development Goals, and even some of the hard-earned progress has been erased by the monumental disruptions caused by the global pandemic. With tremendous uncertainty that still lies ahead, despite the recent news about the development of vaccines that threaten the lives and livelihoods of hundreds of millions around the world. The importance of impact evaluation cannot be overstated. We have already seen a wide range of public and private initiatives aimed at addressing the social economic impacts of the pandemic. Given that resources are limited and time is running out, there is no better time for impact evaluation to prove its worth in determining if and how interventions work. Such knowledge will be crucial to improving effectiveness and efficiency of ad hoc interventions that are now being devised and implemented in a hurry in the midst of the pandemic. Once the pandemic is behind us, we'll have so much more to learn from impact evaluation and hopefully be better prepared for the next pandemic, some say is inevitable. The pandemic has highlighted the concept of resilience, resilience of forms, value chains, economies, and societies. The most crucial element for resilience, in my view, is human capital. In this regard, I'm very pleased to be a part of today's dialogue that investigate challenges and promises for human capital. I'm also looking forward to tuning in on the presentations and discussions investigating the impact of COVID-19 and learning more about big data and impact evaluation, field of education, finance, and technology, areas that have suffered major disruptions and severe setbacks due to the pandemic. I hope this virtual gathering will provide a springboard continuous engagement in the evaluation ecosystem for international development. I have no doubt that it will be a tremendous success with today's fantastic group of scholars willing to share their findings and participants from across the globe ready to make their own contributions. Before I close, allow me to express my very best wishes for the continued flourishing of the partnership among KDI School, 3ie, ADB, and ADBI. We appreciate the opportunity to partner with like-minded professionals who are all committed to creating a collective vision of inclusive and sustainable development around the world, and in particular promoting human capital development in Asia. With your valuable assistance, KDI School will stay committed to increasing the credibility and authenticity of knowledge that we put forward and to informing policy decisions with hard-earned evidence and high-quality data. Finally, I'd like to thank Professor Son, Dr. Yamano, Dr. Arthur, and Professor Kim for their seamless collaboration and great efforts in organizing this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dean Yu. Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to invite Asian Development Bank Institute Dean, Mr. Tetsushi Sonobe. Sonobe-san, please.
Yeah, good afternoon. Yeah, this is Tetsushi Sonobe, Dean of ADB Institute. Nice to meet you. Nice to see you. Thank you for the opportunity to deliver my welcome remarks at this very important conference. First of all, I'd like to extend my congratulations to our co-organizers, especially this year's host, the ADB and the bank's Chief Economist, Professor Yasu Sawada. And second, I'd like to thank all the participants for your attendance, which I take as your support to our idea and belief that solid empirical studies should guide policy making. Thirdly, thank you very much, Dean Yoon and Chief Economist Sawada, and also Manny Jimenez for allowing the ADBI to join this important conference as one of the co-organizers. So because previous two speakers mentioned the current pandemic crisis and the future, I go in the opposite direction, history. Although 6 decades have passed since Theodore William Schultz, Jacob Mincer, and Gary Becker coined the concept of human capital, there remain many mysteries about human capital development. For example, my biggest mystery about human capital is that teachers think they have taught, but the student do not necessarily get it. And then the reason could be the shortage of the teachers teaching skill, or the students' lack of motivation, or students' lack of ability to understand, and which may result from the shortage of nutrition or shortage of sleep. But we don't know how to detect the most important factor, and we don't know when and under what condition which reason is most important. And when it comes to the adult education or training, like training programs for managerial people or business owners, very mysterious thing is why they cannot continue learning or continue putting their management knowledge into practice when such management practices are obviously useful for making profits. And again, there could be many reasons, but we don't know why. And then the considerably large part of foreign aid is about the capacity building and training. So the fact that these mysteries remain suggests that we have also huge mystery about why foreign aid do not work in many cases. So the aid agency think that they have helped, but the developing countries do not necessarily get it. So this is a huge problem. So to address this kind of problem or mystery and other issues, the use of RCT, big data, AI, and so on helps, and it becomes it is becoming indispensable for researchers. So we have to keep pace with the progress in this aspect, if not lead it. So in the past, however, every time when a new tool became available to economists, they produced a lot of papers using the new tool, and then wondered whether they gained any new insights. So this workshop or conference will provide a forum for learning from each other about intriguing uses of new tools, and also for exchanging opinions about new insights. And ADBI is very pleased to add a capacity building and training session to this year's conference agenda. So the session will introduce government officials from across the region to the foundations of impact evaluation to demonstrate its potential as a powerful tool to inform policy development. And personally, I'm extremely happy to be here because this is maybe the first time to see the Manny Jimenez for the first time in maybe 23 years. Yes, so thank you very much. So with this, I wish everyone a very fruitful and productive conference. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dean Sonobe. Very nice remark. So while we wait, why don't we move on to the next agenda first, which is video, which is only a 6-minute video from 3ie on big data systematic use. I have seen this video before. It's very useful. And since one of the theme of this conference is big data, we thought this would be very useful. So please watch.
As we consider the findings from recent impact evaluations and their implications for policy and practice in international development, it is sometimes useful to take a step back and reflect on the state of the field. The rapidly growing volume, granularity, and availability of recorded data around the world, combined with the urgency of responding efficiently and effectively to mitigate and abate the global COVID-19 pandemic, makes this a particularly opportune time to reflect on the use of big data in measuring development impact. This presentation provides an overview of one stock-taking effort recently conducted by 3ie to get a sense of the scope, scale, and applications of big data in measurement studies, impact evaluations, and systematic reviews. What we're seeing right now is the collision of two fields of study: data science, which has grown dramatically in recent years, and impact evaluation. This is generating numerous opportunities for strengthening impact evaluation, but it's also creating challenges to address. One natural question is, what's going on right now? How are people using big data for measuring and evaluating development outcomes? How does this vary by geography or outcome? What are the main technical, methodological, and ethical issues emerging? And more broadly, what lessons can be derived for impact evaluation going forward? To answer these questions, we started by systematically searching the literature for measurement studies, impact evaluations, and systematic reviews using big data to study any type of outcome within the Sustainable Development Goals framework. The search yielded over 17,000 records, which we then screened down to 437 studies, which became the foundation for our systematic map. The systematic map visually summarizes the evidence base, categorizing studies by the big data sources used, listed in the row headings at the left side of the map, by the development outcome studied, shown in the column headings at the top of the map, and by study type, indicated by the legend at the bottom. We also include a confidence rating for the systematic reviews based on a critical appraisal of those papers. In each cell, you can see the size and type of the evidence base linking a particular type of data source to a specific development outcome. If you access the map on the 3ie website, you can also hover over each of these bubbles to see the underlying studies and click on the links to access them. So what did we find? We found that overall, there is a sizable and rapidly growing number of measurement studies using big data, shown in the middle row on the left, but a much smaller number of impact evaluations. This gives us a sense that there is a lot of work being done to develop appropriate measures using big data, which could subsequently be used in impact evaluations. We also see that the bulk of the big data sources are machine-generated, mostly satellites, represented in the light blue, as compared to process-mediated sources in red, including administrative data, call detail records, e-transactions, basically events that are systematically logged as they happen. And also human source data in dark blue at the top, including social media, crowdsourcing, and citizen reporting. The top categories of outcomes studied are environmental sustainability, economic development and livelihoods, urban development, and health and well-being. In terms of geographic distribution, China, India, and the United States are the most studied countries. East Africa and Kenya specifically are the most studied within sub-Saharan Africa, while Brazil and Mexico are the most studied in Latin America. Most other countries had few or no studies. Some challenges we observed relate to data quality, transparency, and ethical issues, including consent, data privacy, data security, and unintended exclusion. Though these issues have been widely noted in the literature, they were discussed only minimally or not at all in many of these studies. There's also a general expectation that impact evaluations using big data will be less expensive than those using conventional data collection methods, but there's very little reported information on costs to do a meaningful comparison. So, what does this all mean? Going forward, we expect to see increased use of big data to measure and evaluate development outcomes. We can reasonably anticipate that clusters of measurement studies in a particular area will be followed by an uptick in impact evaluations as those measures are validated, as those particular data sources become more widely available, and as the methods for accessing and processing the data are more widely understood. It is already widely recognized that big data creates opportunities for faster, cheaper, and in some cases more robust impact evaluations, and that it can also help us investigate topics, locations, and situations that are otherwise more difficult to study, including fragile contexts, difficult to reach areas, humanitarian crises, and global pandemics. The findings of this work help add granularity and nuance to that understanding, but more work is needed, especially in unpacking the many ethical considerations in using big data to measure and evaluate development outcomes. It's also important to keep in mind that big data is a complement and not a replacement for traditional forms of data collection. There is still a critical role for locally gathered data to train machine learning algorithms, for ground truthing to validate variables generated using big data, and for mixed methods fieldwork to help tell the story of what's happening on the ground. The increasing ease of asking and answering questions about development impact from afar makes it more important than ever to prioritize meaningful stakeholder engagement, including of policymakers, implementers, and beneficiaries. It also underscores the need to make sure the advancing technologies of big data capture and processing do not disadvantage local researchers evaluating their own communities. We encourage you to review the Big Data Systematic Map and the accompanying report on the 3ie website. If you have suggestions, comments, or questions for us, or if you would like to share additional studies using big data to measure development outcomes, please email us at 3ieimpact.org. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for nice video from 3ie. Link to the map, systematic map introduced in the video is available from the link in the chat box. Please check your chat box. There is a link to 3ie Big Data Systematic Map. Again, the agenda of this conference is also available from the chat box. Now we would like to move to plenary speech. So Sawada-san, please.
Yes, yeah. Wow, this is a really fascinating video from 3ie, and I just saw a website that's really exciting. For your information, ADB has also started working on impact evaluation using a different type of big data. So now let's move on to the keynote speech by Professor Albert Park, who is an expert in education economics, labor economics, and especially in the context of China. To today's audience, I believe Albert needs no introduction, so I can stop here. But just in case, I'd like to say a few words. He is currently head and chair professor of economics, chair professor of social science, professor of public policy at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He is a research fellow of CIPA London, IZA Bonn, among others. He serves as a editorial board members of World Bank Economic Review and other internationally reputable journals. In recent years, Albert has published articles in leading economics journals on farm performance, poverty and inequality, migration and employment, health and education, and economics of aging in China. Albert has played a leadership role in numerous survey research projects in China, including Charles panel data, China Health and Retirement Longitudinal Study, which is a really important panel data set to analyze aging of China. He previously held tenured faculty appointment at the University of Michigan, Oxford University. His research and commentary has appeared in globally top media, including The Economist magazine, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, China Daily, BBC, CNN, Bloomberg, and also, intriguingly, Freak Economics. More importantly, Albert got his PhD from Stanford, and I was around 5 or 6 years behind Albert. He has been always an important role model for me, studying and also accomplishing research, and now engaging a research project. As a personal self-reminder, Albert and I need to finish a joint paper, which is already more than 5 years old. Anyway, Albert will give us a presentation titled Evaluating Long-Term Impacts of Family and Neighborhood Poverty on Boys and Girls in China. So Albert, in total, we have 50 minutes, 50 minutes. So probably you can spend a 40 minutes presentation followed by 10 minutes or so Q&A. For participants, please use the chat box, as Takashi said, to type in your questions in the middle of presentation. If urgent clarifying questions if I find in the chat box, then I may ask Albert. With that, Albert, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. We're very excited at HKUSD to support work related to impact evaluation. We have quite a few development economists now on our faculty, and our department has helped set up a new Center for Economic Policy, of which there's going to be a major program on development economics action research. So we hope to support impact evaluation efforts in the region and organize activity and become a co-sponsor of this event. Next year, we plan to host the Impact Evaluation Conference with ADB, ADBI, and KDIS. So today I want to talk about some research that I've been working on for many years. It's based on a very long longitudinal data set that I've been collecting. It's a bit unusual for impact evaluation in that it's really a long-term evaluation. And most RCTs, of course, try to go in and measure the impacts of interventions on a short term, but increasingly longer terms, intermediate terms. But I think if we think about what development outcomes we care about, especially if we are interested in poverty and human capital, these are really long-term outcomes that are affected by many things and many factors that children experience while they're growing up. And so this research kind of takes a different approach. We're not looking at any particular policy, but we're looking at how exposure to poverty really affects long-term outcomes. And that does have a lot of policy implications and is a kind of an evaluation study that demonstrates the value of long longitudinal data sets. Okay, so I'm going to try to present results from two papers. One that looks at the impacts of family and neighborhood poverty on both short and long-term outcomes, and a more recent paper that is really work in progress on trying to understand differences by gender in how child poverty affects educational attainment. And by way of motivation, of course, there's a ton of interest recently in inequality, in intergenerational mobility, the work of Piketty and Chetty. And some of the interesting parts of this recent literature have emphasized the importance of neighborhoods. For example, Raj Chetty has shown that If you look at children who move from one neighborhood to another neighborhood, it turns out that growing up at the key parts of your childhood in a better neighborhood really has a huge effect on adult outcomes. There's also a very interesting work by sociologists, Sampson and co-authors at Chicago, looking at the Chicago neighborhoods for many years, and they have emphasized the importance of neighborhood social capital. But we really don't see much research on these neighborhood effects in developing countries, partly because of data limitations and perhaps a lack of an awareness of their importance. Another thing that comes out in some really interesting recent work by David Autor and co-authors, Marie Bertrand and co-authors, and Raj Chetty is understanding these gender differences in vulnerability to poverty. And one robust finding from the US is that boys are much more sensitive to poverty than girls in terms of it influencing their educational outcomes, their crime behavior, other types of social outcomes. Now in China, there is a lot of discussion and evidence that families tend to favor boys, as evidenced by high sex ratios and gender gaps in education and other human capital investments. But there has not been systematic work that assesses how much of these gaps are due to different sensitivity to childhood deprivations. And so our research addresses some of the limitations of these previous studies. One is that a lot of this literature, whether US or elsewhere, has very limited information on the circumstances of childhood. Usually they're trying to relate outcomes to neighborhood aggregate statistics like income per capita and whatnot, without really understanding the child's narrow environment. And of course, to do that, you would have to be following these kids from when they're little and measuring all these different aspects of their immediate environment. And that just doesn't exist in this literature for the most part. Also, all of this work that I've cited is really for the US or developed countries. And there's really, turns out, virtually no evidence from developing country settings about these questions. So so I'm going to go through the results of the first paper and then the second paper and then conclude. So this first paper, we're just asking, how do different dimensions of childhood poverty affect child development and adult outcomes? And we have a huge number of indicators because the survey design collected information from local schools and local communities, local villages, so we can measure kind of family economic deprivations, family social deprivations, school economic and social, village economic and social. So we use a whole bunch of indicators to define deprivation measures across these 6 dimensions of family and community poverty. And this question has, I think, very obvious policy importance because it goes directly to understanding the determinants of well-being in poor environments and to understanding the mechanisms that underlie intergenerational mobility and to understand the long-term kind of economic and social costs of poverty. And from an academic standpoint, as noted just above, we think we're the first to study how multiple dimensions of childhood poverty affect adult outcomes and first to study the long-term impacts of child poverty in a rural developing country setting. Okay, so the study site is Gansu province, is a very poor province in northwest China. A lot of the children who we surveyed and followed over many years have migrated because they grew up in rural Gansu. The panel data set that we collected started with a sample of 2,000 children who were aged 9 to 12 years old in the year 2000. And the original survey design was highly interdisciplinary. So we had a lot of questions about non-cognitive skills, about education issues, sociological issues, as well as economic and well-being issues. And the survey featured this very unique kind of linked survey design where we didn't just survey the children and test them, but we also surveyed the parents, the teachers, their homeroom teachers, the school principals, and the village leaders. And because families tend to not move so much in rural China, in this part of rural China, we had relatively low sample attrition. I think something like 20-25% sample attrition over a 15-year period. Okay, so this is the timing of the different survey waves. The first wave was in the year 2000 when the kids were aged 9 to 12. The second wave was done 4 years later when the kids were teenagers. The third wave was done when the kids were in their late teens or early 20s, so young adults. And then the last wave in 2015 was done when they were from age 23 to 27, so they had mostly entered the labor market and finished their schooling. Even if they had gone to college, most of them would be done by then. So it's pretty nice because we can get the full transition from when they were in primary school all the way to when they enter the labor force, complete their schooling, and start having families. And the lower right-hand picture is a picture of me with one of our kids. I mean, he was 9 to 12 when we started, the guy on my right in the picture, and the other person is his father. And so this was from the last wave done in 2015. So in this rural context in China, we define neighborhood as having two parts. One is the school environment, which of course is very important to kids, and the other is the village. And these are pictures taken from rural Gansu. To measure deprivation across these 6 domains, we come up with a large number of indicators within each domain. And so for each of these indicators, we define an indicator variable for whether the child grew up in a deprived environment. So for family economic, we look at consumption per capita, income per capita, wealth per capita, access to water and home construction materials and cooking fuel. For family social, we're looking at the fathers and mothers' health, their literacy, whether the parents migrated. In this area, it's mostly fathers migrating. Then we have some similar indicators for school economic infrastructure and then school social, which is really about school quality and the quality of teachers and how well the school is run. Village economic has a lot of infrastructure and distance indicators. And then village social is comprised of 3 measures: illiteracy rates among female labor force, illiteracy rates among the male labor force, and then whether kids tend to fight or observed to fight frequently in the village. Okay, so we aggregate these indicators into domain-specific poverty indicators. So for the 6 poverty dimensions, you're poor if you are deprived with respect to at least half of the indicators within the dimension. And then we take these 6 dimensions, and so you can see the poverty rate or deprivation rates across these 6 domains. And then we kind of add them all up. If you're deprived in 3 or more of these 6 domains, then you become multi-context poor. So it aggregates everything into one indicator variable. And in our data, about 18% of the families are multi-context poor. Now, it turns out that our multi-context poverty measure is really not that strongly correlated with traditional poverty measures. So consumption poverty is probably the most preferred poverty measure among economists. And you can see here that among the consumption poor, if you follow across the row for consumption poor, 25% of the sample are consumption poor, but among them, 16.38% are not multi-context poor. Only 9% are kind of multi-context poor. And among the poor that are classified based on this multi-context criteria of deprivation across many domains, only about half of them are consumption poor and the other half are not consumption poor. So not so strongly correlated. And in a lot of other work, we can show that this multi-context poverty measure that we put together is much more predictive of many, many outcomes compared to the traditional poverty measures, which just goes to, I think, show that understanding, especially some of these community deprivations, are really meaningful for understanding child outcomes in poor rural settings, not just in US settings. So the survey in its different waves collected quite a large number of skill indicators, both cognitive skills and non-cognitive skills. So they're listed here. The non-cognitive skills, internalizing behavior is kind of whether you're depressed or withdrawn. Externalizing behavior is whether you kind of act out or get into fights and steal things and things like that. And we also have a college motivation question that we ask all of our kids. And then we also have, when the kids get older, we use some standard scales to look at self-esteem and depression. And then the last way, we even did a Big 5 personality test. Okay, so the empirical strategy here is to focus on the 2000 poverty measures. So the poverty exposure in the first wave when the kids were 9 to 12. And research in the US finds that it's really this early childhood period that really most strongly influences children's outcomes. Later, when you're a teenager, the effects of your environment are much less pronounced than when you're much younger. And we're really focusing mainly due to kind of the question that we're trying to ask. We're really focusing just on conditional expectations using pretty simple OLS regressions of the different outcomes on our multiple poverty measures. And you know, the strength, I think, of what we do is just the richness of the data and the measurements. We can ask a lot of questions that previous research has not been able to ask. But of course, the weakness is in this type of OLS really essentially cross-sectional setting is the potential omitted variable bias, that what we're describing as poverty measures could be correlated with other things across communities that we may be misattributing to our deprivation measures. I think it's worth pointing out that despite this potential bias, there are a number of reasons where we think we're going to still be able to learn quite a bit from this exercise. The first is that in China, in this setting, there's very little residential mobility because of China's internal kind of residential permit system. You can't move easily because you don't like where you live. And so we don't have the kind of sorting bias that would be much more important in places like the US. Also, Chetty, even in the US, found that if you look at the community fixed effect estimates and how they affected children, it was very similar to their estimates used from based on movers, people who moved across communities. And so in one of their QJE papers, they actually use a weighted average. A lot about, from the standpoint of human capital investment, is educational attainment. So in terms of the final educational attainment, this exposure to poverty when you're in primary school is quite predictive of years of schooling. You know, being poor will reduce your expected years of schooling by like 1.75 years, which is quite a lot in this context. And again, we see the effects bigger for girls than for boys. Now, oh, sorry, yeah. So the other thing you can look at is other adult outcomes. I'm sorry, let me go back. Yeah, so you can see that there are also differences in the likelihood that the children are married, not children, the adults now, but the sample, they're married by the 2015 wave. And these effects, or have kids, and these effects are much bigger for girls. But one thing that we notice is that if you control for years of schooling, the significance of those effects go away. In other words, the effect on marriage and fertility seem to be operating largely through the effect on education. So education seems to be kind of the key outcome. And when we look at the effect of different dimensions of deprivation, these 6 domains of deprivation, I'm not going to go through everything. I just want to highlight that you can see that these neighborhood deprivations are quite important for many different outcomes. So here, so this is just a select set of the outcomes. For test scores, the school economic and village economic are important, the village social as well. For externalizing behavior, the community deprivations are important as well, more than the family. For years of education, we see that the family deprivations are still most important, but some of the community deprivations are also significant and important, and together really account for quite a lot. So some of the takeaways of this work are that child poverty has significant impacts on a range of child and adult outcomes, that this multidimensional poverty measure has substantially more explanatory power than traditional poverty measures, and in particular, because they capture these school and community deprivations, which are clearly important in explaining outcomes. And then we find this gender difference where girls are more affected by child poverty in China, which is exactly the opposite of the pattern observed in the US, where boys are more sensitive to poverty. Okay, I want to go to the second paper, which is about focusing on this gender difference. One thing we can do in the gender paper, which makes the identification much stronger than in the kind of overall expected effects of poverty, is that we can compare girls and boys within the same family. So we can really control for unobserved household level differences, which is obviously much, in terms of trying to understand the differences in the effects of poverty for boys and girls. And we do that as our kind of preferred specification. We also, because we have rich data across all of these ways, we can, I think, make some progress in understanding the specific channels through which this exposure to childhood poverty generates the gender gaps in education. So for example, some of the channels might be that these neighborhood differences are really important as opposed to the household differences. There's also a possibility that biological differences in early childhood may create vulnerabilities that show up in our longer term measures. In other words, we're measuring poverty when kids are 9 to 12, but it could be correlated to poverty when the kids were infants and born. And we know that being deprived in utero or in the first couple of years of life can have long-term effects on your health and education. And so we want to rule out that that's the channel through which this is operating, or at least see if there's any evidence on that. We also can look at whether families make differential investments in boys and girls in poor settings. And we can also look at to what extent the different effects on girls is due to gender attitudes of parents being different in poor areas versus rich areas. And we can also look at sibship structures to try to understand which types of children bear the brunt of this gender bias in poorer environments. Okay, so we're going to run a pretty standard diff and diff type specification with a household fixed effect and interacting a female dummy with poverty. So we're really identifying these effects off of families that have at least one boy and at least one girl in the family. And we can control for some other attributes. And so let's just go to the estimates. So if you look at the first column, it just tells you that on average, girls get 0.6 years less education than boys in the overall sample. And in column 4 is for the fixed effect sample, where we look at family fixed effects. So even within households, girls are getting a similarly less, 0.68 years of schooling. If we add in a poverty dummy and the interaction of gender and poverty, you can see that whether or not we include fixed effects, we find this negative interaction effect, which means that girls in poor households get a much less education compared to girls in non-poor households. And so if we look at column 5, which is kind of the preferred fixed effects specification, there's this -1 year. So a girl on average gets 0.5 years less in a non-poor environment, but gets -1.5 years less in a poor environment. So that's a huge interaction effect in terms of its magnitude. Now, the other thing we do here, just to get a sense of the relative importance of the family deprivations versus the community deprivations, is we kind of aggregate our 2 family deprivation measures into 1 family measure, and then our 4 community measures or neighborhood measures into 1 measure. And you can see here that both of them are important. So if you look at column 3, both the family and community deprivations really affect years of schooling. Here, the interaction effects with female are negative in both cases, but not statistically significant. When we look at the, maybe partly they're correlated with each other. If we use the fixed effects estimate, we actually do find a larger effect of community poverty in explaining this interaction effect of why girls do worse in poor areas compared to boys and compared to non-poor areas. And that it's relatively less explained by the family poverty, this interaction effect. So that, again, points to the community measures as being important in terms of we're thinking about where is it that girls get disadvantaged in these poor settings. Okay, so we can put in the 6 domains separately, which we do in this table. This is without the family fixed effects, most of this table, so you can see the direct effects as well as the interaction effects. A lot of the interaction terms are not significant. The household one, if you look at columns 1 and 2, the household, I'm sorry, if you look at column 2, the household economic poverty is significant in terms of interacting with female. But if you look at the community ones, most of the interaction terms are negative, and some of them are reasonably large in magnitude, but none of them are statistically significant, whether we put in them in one at a time or together, or whether we use the family fixed effects. And so even though we found in the previous table that overall community matters in explaining this interaction term of poverty and gender, if you put them in one by one, it's hard to find one of them that stands out. They all seem to contribute to greater or lesser extent so that the total importance becomes important. But the signs are all in the right direction. We can also unpack it, because when I've presented this before, people always ask, well, what about the specific indicators? What is it in these domains that is really mattering and what is not? So here we're reporting the effect of the different community poverty indicators within these domain indicators to see which of them kind of explain. This is where we basically put them in, we put the individual indicators into a regression in place of the aggregate indicators, see which ones are kind of driving the action here. And you can see here that, and this is actually explaining the interaction of gender and poverty. So not the overall effect, but the interaction effect. So the effect that we're trying to explain. And you can see that the school economic ones, 2 of the 3 measures have this negative bars, which means that they help explain why girls do relatively worse in poor environments than boys and than in richer environments. And in the school social, you see there's a few different indicators, mostly focused on teachers, that seem to also explain some of the negative interaction effect. The one I wanted to focus on a little bit here is the village social indicators, because they're really interesting. The village social indicator has these 3 variables. One is the male illiteracy rate, the second is the female illiteracy rate, and the third is group fighting among children. And all of them are significant, but one of them goes in the opposite sign than the other 2. So what is it saying? It's saying that in places where there's more male illiteracy, then you actually see boys doing relatively worse off. In places with higher female illiteracy, you see girls doing relatively worse off. And in places where you see lots of fighting among children, boys do relatively worse off. So as a whole, the village social indicator does not explain female deprivation, although one of the indicators, female illiteracy, does. But the reason it doesn't really make sense, because 2 of these indicators really leverage the experience of boys much more than the experience of girls, and are consistent kind of other findings in other contexts. Okay, so I want to jump on. So we're going to look at some of the channels now. We try to see if this poverty indicator in 2000 actually predicts early life outcomes, and it doesn't. It's not significant. So that's not what's really driving it. We also look at effects of this poverty indicator interacted with gender on different types of investments in kids. So educational fees that are required, educational fees that are voluntary, and some time investments of the parents in the kids, and also the children's time allocation. And one thing, I mean, the only significant thing here is that girls do more housework, but nothing is really so significant in terms of the interaction effects. Although it does, the magnitudes do suggest that girls in poor households tend to do more housework. There is a positive interaction effect. But this is not the smoking gun. It's not so much being driven by differential investments of parents, it seems. At least we don't have the power to pick that up. Now, we also ask some questions about the mothers in terms of their attitudes towards gender roles, and then their expectations about whether they're going to have to rely on their sons as opposed to their daughters for support when they're old, and also whether they have differences in the expectation of the returns to schooling for boys and girls in the local labor market. And here we redefine the dependent variable as the sister-brother difference in years of schooling so that these estimates are a bit more intuitive. What is it saying? It's saying that if you start, again, the first column just starts out with the gap, the gender gap in years of schooling within households, which is minus 0.66 years. And then we throw in kind of measures of attitudes and expectations to see if they can explain part of the gender gap. And if you control for them, do they reduce the effect of poverty, because maybe poverty is just correlated with these gender attitudes or expectations. And what we see is no significance of the gender family role attitudes in explaining the gender gap in education. We do see that the kind of economic expectation variables do significantly predict gender gaps. In other words, if mothers say they need to rely more on sons than daughters in old age, you will see them investing less in your girls' years of schooling compared to boys. And if they think the labor market returns to education are greater for boys, they will also invest less in girls relative to boys in terms of education. But even though these are predictive, controlling for them does not really reduce the effect of multi-context poverty on the gender gap, which means that these expectations are not strongly correlated with poverty, and so don't explain the poverty gap, even though they are of importance in explaining gender differences in education. So again, we are not finding kind of a smoking gun in the mechanisms that really affects it. Okay,
Albert,
so,
you have 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm almost done. Last result here is about SIB-ship structure and the impacts on poverty. And it's really interesting here because so this table just describes the years of education for girls and boys who are in different family sizes, either single children or in two-child families. If they're older girls or younger girls with younger brothers or older sisters, et cetera, all the combinations are here. And what I want to focus on is if you look at the female male under family size 2, the female male row, you're going to see that the first child has only 8.4 years of schooling, whereas the second child has 10.4 years of schooling. There's this huge 2-year gap in education between the girls and boys when it's an older daughter and a younger son. And you don't see any significant gaps in any other structure. So even girls, if they're the oldest daughter, but the younger sibling is a girl, or if they're younger daughters and the older sibling is either a boy or a girl, you just don't see a huge difference in education. The brunt of this negative effect on girls in the poor families is really these older sisters. And in non-poor families, you also just don't see it. So it's quite remarkable. If you put it in a regression framework and look at the older sibling, younger sibling differences in these different family structures, female, 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 male, male, female, male, male, again, you see it's all coming from the female male families and the older girls who are suffering. Okay, so just to summarize, so I'm not going to go through all, this just reiterates all of these findings on the gender paper. We do, I think, find some evidence that the community effects matter for explaining the gender gap. So something's going on in the schools and in the neighborhoods. But also this effect on the older girls, I think, suggests that it's definitely a decision being made by parents. We're not seeing it in the investment in spending, but we are seeing it in the enrollment choices. Because any other general factor of poverty should affect everyone in the family the same, right? So the fact that it's so specific to a specific gender birth order focus means that it has to be decisions being made by the parents that are disfavoring these older girls. So I think that helps us understand the mechanism. And so finally, in terms of the policy implications of the second paper, as in the US, the poor neighborhoods matter in terms of explaining gender gaps in education, but it's opposite, obviously, it's the girls that are more sensitive. And so much more focus needs to be placed on understanding how these low quality schools are more negatively impacting girls. Also, given the evidence that poor families are investing less, mainly in the oldest girls, that suggests that policymakers should consider innovations that target these specific girls. So let me stop here and allow some time for questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Albert, for really exciting presentation. Two papers, and from the IE impact evaluation viewpoint, we need to always have three elements: specifying outcome, and also define intervention, and then thirdly, eliminate the selection bias. Many people are too much snobbish about the third, eliminating selection bias. But I think, Albert, you have a very really amazing data tracking almost 20 years of children around the year 2000, and then really rich data to capture the first element, outcome, and also second element, intervention. In this context, poverty, grasping poverty is multidimensional, and we having very rich data is really useful. So we have probably 5-6 minutes for Q&A. So we have already one question in the chat box. Abu, this is like a clarifying question. Given one-child policy in China, the sample you are looking, one male, one female, or other combination, is it generalizable? So probably this is a clarifying question. Albert.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It turns out for this cohort, they were born in the late 80s, 86 to 1990. At that time, in this part of China, family planning policy, one-child policy, or even the 1.5-child policy was not strictly enforced. And so you see most of our kids have multiple siblings actually in the data. So the percentage of kids that live in one-child families, it's only, I think, less than 10%. So it's not a binding issue for this sample. So now there is still something going on here in that you don't see very many female-female. If you look at two-child families, there's not many female-female families, because a lot of families, if they have female-female, they actually keep having kids until they get a son, right? And so we're also looking at the robustness when we don't restrict to two-child families, and we look at families of any size, but still look at the effect on older daughters. And it still, I think, comes up mainly robust, that the older daughters are the ones who bear the brunt.
So clarifying, so in your data, you see mostly older sister and younger brother, that combination of female male, not the opposite.
Well, I think in our data and many data sets from China, the first sibling, the first kid is pretty much a coin flip. It's about half girls and half boys. But then If you have a boy, some will stop, some may have more kids. Most of our families in this setting are going to have at least 2 kids. And so we get a lot of boy girls, and we get boy boys, and we get girl boys.
Oh, okay.
But it's like girls are relatively few because they keep
right.
having, it'll be girl boy or girl boy, you know, whatever.
I see. Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Probably you can unmute the microphone and come in. Probably we can take 2 or 3 questions. No question. Maybe,
actually,
yeah, sure.
Yeah. Actually,
please kindly identify yourself quickly and please confine your question to 1 or at most
sure.
2.
I'm Hisaki Kono, and I wrote on the chat box, but you're finding the difference in the education years between first and second girls is quite interesting. So did you check the kind of difference in time for household work between the first and second girls among the poor? As elder girls might be expected to take care of the younger son.
I don't think we've looked at that way, so I think we should do that. That's a very good suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask 1 question?
Sure.
About the background? In this data set of Gansu survey of children and family, I understand that this Gansu is a poor province. Then during these 15 years of research, was there any policy interventions to reduce poverty for some villages and for others not? Do you have that kind of confounding factors in this research setup?
Well, China has, we're in a year where China is planning to eliminate poverty altogether. I'm sure you'll be seeing the headlines before the end of the year that China has eliminated. So they've had a lot of policies through the years in different villages, but I think our measures account for those to the extent that, you know, a lot of the poverty programs will be, you know, building infrastructure or other things. So we're asking about what is the existing infrastructure, you know, net of some of those programs. Poverty policies also can give transfers to households, but those also show up in our measures. So we are, I think, in terms of our income measures, so we are kind of capturing the net effect, you know, the net experience at the end, even after policies of what the children are experiencing. But there are policies in China throughout the period. I mean, one thing in terms of what's happening in these communities, I would say the most dominant kind of force shaping people's lives is out-migration, right? Most of our kids, by the time they're 20, in the last wave, had migrated. So very few of them still live in the villages. And so the survey turns out to be a pretty good survey of migration as well, because I think most of the remoter parts of China, you see similar patterns of large out-migrations. And the out-migration has really, I think, been very beneficial to these communities and to these kids.
Okay, actually, in chat box, there are 3 questions or comments. I think the first 2, probably I can read out. Sanyong's question, does the gap between, I assume this is an age gap between 2 children, FM, MM, have impact on the schooling? If the sister is 2 to 3 years older, does it impact on the status of education? And then second question, what kind of policy suggestions for the elder girls? So these questions, 2 questions, Albert may want to respond. And then final question is possible explanation to Ab's questions. I think this is a very nice comment by Lin Fei. By the way, second question is by Moon Young. And the previous question was asked by Tak Kurosaki, I think. Okay, thank you very much.
So we haven't looked at the age gap and how it affects these results, but it's a comment I've gotten once before, so I think we'll try to look at that. And then the policy suggestions, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe we can all think about that together. I mean, if you are, I mean, the reason why it's not always obvious is, I mean, the most simplest thing would be to give a scholarship program for older girls, right? And that, assuming there's no avoidance or, you know, manipulation of that, then that might work. It's always a bit tricky to recommend very specific policies because you're never sure how households will respond to those things. But I think when I wrote that in the policy, I had something like that in mind, I guess. Or even if you had mentoring programs or other things, there should be a particular focus in getting the older girls involved.
Okay, thank you very much, Albert, for a really fascinating presentation, and we had a very good discussion as well. Everyone, please join me to thank Albert by clicking reaction and join me to thank. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Albert. So
and
now,
one last thing I just want to say.
Yeah, okay.
I think this work really suggests that even in the RCTs, you know, we got to keep following up over as many years as we can, because the combination of a cleanly identified RCT and then really a long-term follow-up is really powerful. And one of the concerns is that in a lot of RCTs, the sample sizes are kind of powered to just be enough to estimate something initially, but they don't kind of take into account future attrition and other things that might matter. So probably to do longer term tracking, you would need to have bigger samples. You know, you should over sample at the start if that's a intent, or to have the option value of doing that going forward.
Yeah. To your long-term, tracking and analysis is really important complement to RCT-based rigorous evaluation. Thank you very much again, Albert. Thank you. So Takashi, over to you.
Thank you, Albert. Now I'd like to invite Mani. So he is a former executive director of International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, Mr. Mani Jimenez. Mani, please.
Thank you very much. And first, I'd like to thank Albert for a stimulating talk. I came a bit late, but I heard most of it, and it's really fascinating to see how this project has evolved over time, Albert. Congratulations to you and Emily and your colleagues. Yasu, Dean Jong-il, you and Dean Tatsushi Sonobe and colleagues, as was mentioned, I'm the former executive director of 3ie, where I'm still a senior fellow. Because of the time differences, Marie Gardner, the current ED and senior management, is unable to attend, but wanted me to extend a warm welcome to all of you and to thank our co-sponsors, ADB and the KDI school in particular, and to say just how proud 3ie has been to participate as one of the original co-founders of this conference. I see now that it expanded quite a bit with the inclusion of ADB and ADBI from the small but really great conference that we had when we started off. As many of you know, 3ie is one of the world's leading proponents in the generation and use of evidence for decision making. 3ie has sponsored over 250 impact evaluations over the past 10 years, for example. It has gone beyond that and has also worked on synthesizing that evidence through systematic reviews. What I wanted to talk about just very briefly is that 3ie has continued building on this architecture for evidence by first innovating through the development of evidence gap maps, which gives you a visualization of the link between outcomes and interventions, and to what extent there's the density of evidence in each of those cells. It's also tried to provide as much access as possible to evidence. I encourage you all to investigate 3ie's development evidence portal, where there are about 5,000 studies that have already been coded. 3ie is continuing to do more of this over time, in which are searchable by topic and by research question, which is open to everybody. And finally, it's also providing direct support to decision makers, both in governments and in other organizations, using this database to have in-demand analysis, depending upon in a timely way to decision makers to really encourage the use of evidence as well as the generation of evidence. The last thing I'd like to say is to introduce an innovation that 3ie has had in terms of the main theme of this conference, which is big data and evidence, and what it's been doing. And one of the things it's actually done is to employ its evidence gap map technology to just ask the question, where are big data being used and for studying which outcomes? And if you bear with me, there's just a short 5-minute video that we'd like to show that summarizes this project. So may I ask ADB to kindly show the video? Okay.
Manny, you be happy to know that we have already shown the video before the plenary session. So we enjoyed it, very nice. And I want to remind all participants again, the link to the video is available in the chat box at the very top. So please visit the chat box and find the link to the video. And yeah, otherwise it's not video. Sorry about the map. The framework presented in the video. Okay, and then I'm sure from that website you can find all other materials from 3ie website. So Manny, thank you very much.